Okay, thanks everybody for joining us here today. My name is Joshua Tucker. I am the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and on behalf of my compatriot at the Harriman Institute, Alexander Cooley, it's a great pleasure here to welcome you today to our webinar on Sputnik V and vaccine diplomacy in Russia. Just to say a tiny little bit about what we're doing here, this is part of what's called the New York City Russia Public Policy Seminar Series, and this has been going on for a few years now. It started off with a couple of events each semester, and as we moved online, we've morphed into doing about one of these every month, and we've taking off August since the pandemic started. But these are opportunities that we have tried to do to get combine scholars and practitioners together to talk about issues of pressing issues around Russia public policy. And we are continuing to bring these to you over the course of the semester. They're a joint effort between the Harriman Institute at Columbia and the Jordan Center here at NYU. I want to flag that we'll have more coming the rest of this semester. In April, we're going to have one on Russia's private sector. In May, we'll be talking about frozen conflicts. And we'll be probably having more after that in June and July, and we're still working on topics for that. So without further ado, just to let you know, the way that this is set up here is we're going to be using a webinar format, which means that we would love to have you guys adding questions, Q&A for our panelists. You will see on your Zoom screen or the Q&A button, you can add questions at any time there. We also have, you can add questions on the YouTube comments if you're watching on YouTube. The way that we will approach this is we will have we've invited each of our participants here today, who Alex is going to introduce. We've invited each of our participants to give opening remarks of approximately 10 minutes. We'll have the opening remarks from each of the participants. When that's done, we'll then move to questions. Sometimes maybe if you guys are being quiet, Alex and I will start off with some questions ourselves. If the if the Q&A box is full, we'll move straight to questions at that point in time. Anyway, we're looking forward to having a super interesting discussion. I'm incredibly excited about the panelists we've been able to get here, but I'm going to toss it over to Alex to introduce the panelists. And in the interest of keeping things moving online, Alex will introduce one panelist at a time, and so each one will get their introduction before they give their opening remarks. Alex?
Josh, thanks so much. Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you sharing your lunchtime or your dinner time with us here. So today's topic has been in the making for some time. The announcement last summer that Sputnik V was going to be a registered vaccine was sent quite a lot of waves across both public health and political circles. And there are both really interesting domestic dimensions to this, as well as international dimensions, as well as questions about research and research review surrounding Sputnik V. So these are some of the topics we brought our distinguished panelists today to think about and share with us. Our first panelist has been commentating nonstop, and I've seen her on various panels just this week. So we are so grateful to have Professor Judy Twigg, who's a professor of political science at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she teaches courses on global health, on international political economy, and Russian politics. And in this intersection between public health policy and Russian politics, she's ideally position to offer some insights into the background behind Sputnik V and some of the current issues and challenges that policymakers in Russia are thinking about. Judy, thanks so much again for joining us today.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to the Jordan Center and to the Harriman Institute for the opportunity to share the screen with such a great group of panelists. So as Alex just said, Russia was the first out of the gate with a vaccine against coronavirus. We all know that Sputnik V for victory, was the first COVID vaccine in the world to be approved by a national regulator back in August of 2020. And since then, it's been rolled out widely across Russia. It's very easy to get vaccinated in Moscow. There's wide availability at clinics. If you go to GUM, the luxury department store that's right off Red Square, you can even get free ice cream along with your shot. So in fact, in Moscow and in other parts of Russia, it appears that supply of the Sputnik V vaccine now exceeds demand. There is substantial vaccine hesitancy in Russia. Many people are COVID deniers. Many people just don't think that COVID is that big a deal. Many are anti-vaccine in general. In other words, they won't take Sputnik V, but they won't take any vaccines. And many specifically don't trust this particular vaccine. And I think Enrico will talk later about some of the questions about the data on this vaccine's safety and efficacy. But as a result, despite all the hoopla around Sputnik V, we're in a situation where actual vaccine coverage in Russia is actually relatively low compared to many other countries, certainly much lower than the leaders, so Israel, the UK, even the United States. According to the New York Times Global Vaccine Tracker, in terms of vaccines delivered per capita, Russia now ranks number 60 in the world. So that's the domestic situation in Russia. Internationally, in terms of exercising soft power through the provision of vaccines, Russia clearly got off to a head start. It was aggressively marketing Sputnik V well before any of the Western vaccines had cleared regulatory hurdles. So Sputnik V is now registered in 46 countries. As of today, they added North Macedonia to the list. That's the most recent one. And it's hard to keep up because the number is increasing every day. They've even made some headway in European Union countries like Hungary, Slovakia, before there's been official approval by the EU's medicines regulator. So there are a lot of countries that have deals to get Sputnik V doses straight from Russia. There are even more that are set to receive Sputnik V doses that are being manufactured somewhere else, India in particular, or lots of countries that are set to receive the formula and the technology so that they can make Sputnik V themselves. So what are Russia's goals here? I think there are three. The first is that Sputnik V is clearly seen by Russia as a symbol of its return to great power status. It's about pride, it's about national stature, it's about respect. Being the first in the world to blaze the trail for the way out of this once-in-a-century global pandemic puts Russia back on the map as a great scientific technological power, goes the Russian argument. They want to change the narrative. Russia is not some drunken backwater that relies solely on the sale of oil and gas and minerals and other things that you can dig out of the ground. And they portray Sputnik V this way deliberately. When the vaccine was first approved, they launched a website for it. And it had a feature for its first couple of weeks that the website was live, where it took a couple of seconds for the site to load. There was a built-in delay when you launched the site. And during that delay, there was a little button on the screen, and it said, turn your sound all the way up and push the button. And when you pushed that button, you heard the audio of the beeps that were broadcast from space back in 1957, when the first Soviet satellite, Sputnik, the first man-made object in space, was launched. That was obviously a hallmark moment for Soviet superiority in the space race. It's no accident that they're evoking that moment now, even calling the vaccine Sputnik. Second, Russia clearly wants to exercise some soft power here. Poor and middle-income countries are desperate for access to vaccines, and Russia realizes that obviously there's potential diplomatic benefit from appearing as a savior during this unprecedented global crisis. And in particular, Russia is contrasting its own generosity against the initial selfishness of the United States, Canada, the UK, that gobbled up all of the first available doses of Pfizer and Moderna, the other Western vaccines, through pre-purchase agreements. So the rich countries pre-purchased enough vaccine to cover their own people several times over and left the rest of the world with nothing. Now, this isn't the first time this has happened. If you think back, for example, to the early years of the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the initial production of life-saving antiretroviral medications, the rich countries got those years before the millions of dying people in sub-Saharan Africa got access to them. So Russia is very anxious right now to highlight these inequities. And then last, but certainly not least for Russia, this is a business opportunity. COVID vaccines are going to be a multi-billion-dollar business, and Russia obviously would like to maximize its market share. They're offering Sputnik V at about $20 for a full course of the 2 doses. That's quite a bit cheaper than Pfizer or Moderna. And I also think there's a longer term set of business interests here. Russia has not traditionally been much of a player on the global pharmaceutical market. And clearly they'd like this vaccine to be a wedge to get other countries to consider purchasing their other pharmaceutical products also. There's one other economic incentive here, and that is to get good vaccines to Central Asian countries that send migrant labor to Russia. They want those flows of cheap labor to reignite again, because there are jobs in Russia that need to be filled. There's a shortage of construction workers, delivery people, other jobs that are traditionally filled by migrant labor. So there's a lot that Russia wants to achieve with this vaccine, but there are a couple of important caveats here when we think about how likely it is that Russia is achieving these goals or is likely to achieve these goals. First is that the way Russia started with Sputnik V didn't exactly inspire confidence. Both international and Russian consumers have lingering doubts about Sputnik V because it was approved before it had even entered large-scale clinical trials. So Russia, in a word, put the cart way before the horse with Sputnik V. And there's a perception, and it's a correct perception, that development was rushed, that Sputnik V skipped the line, so to speak. It didn't go through scientific and regulatory vetting because of top-down political pressure for Russia to be first. And there was a fear that this may have impacted and be continuing to impact the vaccine's quality. So Putin took a huge gamble when he launched this thing before it was proven. And it's a gamble that appears to be paying off, but the risk was tremendous. Second, Russia's efforts have been able to achieve such visibility with Sputnik V because largely the traditional global health powers, the United States, Western Europe, had essentially withdrawn from this space. And this is especially an issue with the United States. There was a vacuum left by American abandonment of global health institutions, global health responsibility. And this predates the current pandemic. It goes back to the early days of the Trump administration when he announced that he was leaving the World Health Organization and now refusing to contribute to COVAX, the international facility intended to ensure vaccine access for poor countries. This left a clear opening for Russia to realize its soft power gains with Sputnik V. So the key question now is whether or not that window of opportunity is closing. Now, is it the case that Russia's golden moment, when it was the only game in town, when Sputnik V and the vaccine generosity around Sputnik V was getting all the headlines, is that golden moment already passing? Is it being supplanted, nudged aside by COVAX, that global vaccine facility, and by other bilateral deals that are starting to be cut to help poor and middle income countries, as well as the intervention from the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and others? So there are two important points here. The first is there was a moment not too long ago when it appeared that COVAX might not get off the ground at all. But it's clear now the Biden administration has pledged $2 billion, another $2 billion on the way if other countries and other donors matched. It's clear that COVAX is going to be the centerpiece for global vaccine access across the rest of this year through 2022. And I note that Russia has chosen not to participate in COVAX. It's not donating funds, and it's chosen not to have Sputnik V as part of the COVAX portfolio of vaccines. Russia has said specifically that it prefers to transfer Sputnik V through the kinds of bilateral deals that it's been making. And the second point is that with Sputnik V, the action hasn't yet caught up with the talk, with the promises. There's a lot of noise about the number of countries that have approved Sputnik V, 46 of them, like we said, but only 18 countries are actually using Sputnik V right now. And some of the biggest countries that have been promised doses, 125 million doses to India, 25 million to Nepal, I think 10 million to Brazil. Those countries' regulators haven't yet approved Sputnik V. So it's also important to recognize that most of the countries that have taken delivery of Sputnik V aren't entirely reliant on it. All of these countries have diversified vaccine portfolios. None is relying only on Russia. So the key question out there is, how much does Sputnik V actually end up getting produced and used as production and distribution ramps up for AstraZeneca, Johnson & Johnson, some of the other relatively inexpensive vaccines that also don't require ultra-low temperatures? How long is everybody's memory? How much in the long term will people remember the Trump administration's selfishness? How long will they remember Russia's initial exclusivity in the realm of vaccine diplomacy? How much will they remember the scientific gamble that Russia took with premature approval of the vaccine? How lasting is the goodwill that Russia is currently achieving with these early promises? And does that newfound goodwill for Russia exist in places that are going to be useful for Russia in the longer term? So last point I'll make in closing is that when we come back to the big picture, obviously the most important perspective is that the world just needs as many good vaccines as we can get, deployed as quickly as we can deploy them, no matter where they come from. And in that sense, it's kind of unfortunate that the tenor of the conversation has been so much about competition rather than collaboration. And Russia makes this point all the time, right? Sputnik V's official tagline is that it's the vaccine for all mankind. But that's a little disingenuous since Russia's saying this while it's clearly out there touting the superiority of its own vaccine, and something that I'm sure we'll talk about later, even engaging in disinformation about Western vaccines, especially about the Pfizer vaccine. So I'm sure we'll come back to a lot of these points in detail later on, but thank you for the opportunity to contribute some opening thoughts.
Judy, thanks so much. And as you talk about the good of all mankind, I'm reminded today, of course, is International Women's Day. So happy International Women's Day to everyone. And as one of our Q&A has already pointed out, did you know that 17 out of 31 key members of the Sputnik V development team are women? Thank you, Marina, for pointing that out. Next, we go to Josh Yaffa. I like to say our own Josh Yaffa, but of course, we would say that. But we're so grateful every time he comes to share his insights for us. And I would point everyone to an article, his deep dive in the New Yorker earlier in February on this race in Sputnik development. Josh, thanks again for joining us. And we're really eager to get your thoughts on the inside track of how Sputnik came about.
Thanks, Alex, for the invitation, and Josh as well for the invitation, and glad to be here and get a chance to talk about Sputnik with such an esteemed panel of guests. So indeed, I spent several months or more really, starting in the summer, right around or shortly after Putin's surprise announcement that Judy mentioned in her talks that Sputnik was in fact registered and the world's first registered vaccine. That caught my attention, that caught everyone's attention. It was at a time, if we remember, when the leading Western vaccine programs, Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, were all months away from even applying for a registration, and the Sputnik approval really came out of nowhere and caused both a lot of interest and a lot of concern, and on my part, a desire to understand exactly what was this vaccine, what role was it likely to play in Russia and the world, and what kind of scientific properties did it have, how much did it resemble other vaccines, and what can we say about its likely efficacy. I ended up having the chance, quite luckily, to make 2 visits to the Institute Gamaleya, the scientific center in Moscow where the vaccine was developed. I took those trips in November and December, and was in fact able to visit the very laboratory where Sputnik V was developed, and met with the director of Gamaleya and the lead developer of Sputnik, Denis Lagunov. It was clear to me that the scientists at Gamaleya Institute were very excited about their creation, proud, but a little wary, and this is me reading a bit between the lines, wary of the kind of boosterism and the kind of patriotic sense of world-beating victory that we were hearing at the same time on Russian state TV, coming from Putin himself, who took every opportunity he could find to remind audiences that not only had Russia come up with a successful and apparently effective, as he claimed, vaccine, but also the first vaccine. That question of being first was repeated over and over and over again on state television and by Russian officials in a way that Judy very cogently and convincingly spoke about, and I'll add a bit more to later. I think that campaign of boosterism in a way played against Sputnik, at least for a domestic audience, but I think also internationally. I think a more toned down rollout campaign would have actually served Russia's interests more than the real chest beating victory lap that it ended up taking. Quickly about the vaccine itself. The construction, as it were, of Sputnik V is based on 2 earlier vaccine prototypes that the Gamaleya Institute created in recent years. The first one was a vaccine for Ebola. And in the summer of 2017, the Gamaleya Institute sent a couple thousand doses of their Ebola vaccine to Guinea for a phase 3 trial. The problem was that by that point in the national epidemic in Guinea, Ebola had largely petered out. So it meant it wasn't really possible to carry out a phase 3 trial. So despite Gamaleya claiming success, that was a case where it was unclear exactly how and if the Ebola vaccine worked. The same story repeated itself a year later with the Gamaleya vaccine for MERS, a kind of related, somewhat precursor to coronavirus. But that outbreak also subsided, thankfully, not turning into the kind of global pandemic that coronavirus did. And so that vaccine prototype also didn't really go anywhere, didn't reach a phase 3 trial or even feature in scientific journals abroad. So the reputation, as far as I could tell from talking to international experts of Institute Gamaleya, was that a place staffed by sound, educated, reasonable professional scientists, but without a real proven track record one way or another. Nonetheless, when the coronavirus pandemic emerged, it was clear to the scientists at Gamaleya how to build a coronavirus vaccine. They went to the same technology they had for their Ebola and MERS vaccines, and that technology is so-called vector vaccine technology. The scientists on this panel and those watching, I'm sure, can correct my rather crude lay retelling of what a vector vaccine is and how it works, but the essential gist of it is that you take a harmless vaccine, in this case, adenovirus, a virus that causes the common cold, you render it inactive, incapable of multiplying, and then you essentially insert the spike protein, in this case of coronavirus, in previous cases, Ebola and MERS, but the vaccine that you want to inoculate against, you take the protein from that vaccine, you insert it into this vector, the inactivated cold virus, and then which functions as the vector, hence the name, and then you have a kind of ready-made delivery system or delivery vehicle for introducing into the body the necessary protein so as to create an immune response against the virus that you want to be protecting against. The advantage of vector technology is it has a kind of cut and paste quality, as Denis Logunov and others at Gamaleya Institute explained. In other words, once you create this vector construction, it's rather simple, at least in the world of advanced contemporary microbiology, to swap out the payload, as it were. You have the space shuttle stays the same, but you swap out the cargo. And so within a matter of weeks, they had a prototype vaccine ready using this existing adenovirus vector platform and swapping out this the kind of cargo, as it were, for the coronavirus spike protein. The first dose, the Sputnik V, like many vaccine programs, including the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, is a 2-shot regimen. The first dose is adenovirus 26, which is a rather rare form of cold virus that most people have not encountered before and therefore don't have immunity to. The second shot comes or is delivered via adenovirus 5, which is a more common strain, but is believed, at least as I was able to understand, to help induce long-lasting immunity by activating T cells. This method of using 2 different viruses for a 2-stage vector vaccine is common, or at least has a kind of precedent and is established in science. That the goal of this, and we can talk about it more for those who are interested, is essentially you want to confuse, as it were, the immune system so that it focuses on the COVID-19 protein. You don't want the immune system attacking the vector, which would render the efficacy of the vaccine less. So in that sense, the international vaccine experts I spoke to said, in theory, all of this, what I just explained, the entire kind of scientific approach and construction of Sputnik V looks good on paper. It makes sense. This is not a kind of crazy mad scientist approach to vaccine technology. It's well within contemporary vaccine mainstream. It's also worth saying that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is also a vector vaccine, and it also uses adenovirus 26 as its delivery vector. So there's a lot of scientific overlap with some other vaccines out there. That said, in talking with scientists, they were judging the kind of theoretical potential of Sputnik V to prove effective. All of them said that no conclusions really of any seriousness could be drawn, of course, until we saw the data, and that's where the problems and questions arose. And I'm sure that Enrico will speak in much more detail about this question. I'll just kind of try and speed through it quickly to give the overview. But essentially, this approval in in August 11th of last year, when Putin announced on television with great fanfare that Russia now had the first coronavirus vaccine in the world, that registration happened, as Judy helpfully told us, not only before phase 3 trials had begun, but in fact, even before phase 1 and 2 trials had been published or had their results published in international journals. So we essentially had no data whatsoever at the time of the approval. And once that data was published, first in September, I believe, in The Lancet, the results of the phase 1 and 2 trials were published, a publication that led to a great amount of kind of questioning and some criticism. Again, Enrico will speak about that in more detail. Nonetheless, from where I sat in Moscow, as summer turned into fall and we edged closer to winter, it looked like the results were promising. It seemed to me, I was beginning to have a gathering hypothesis that the PR rollout was a kind of a forced and unnecessary own goal. All the hype had the exact opposite of effect of leading to a great amount of suspicion surrounding Sputnik V, but the science and efficacy was beginning to look sound when, for example, in December, Institute Gamaleya announced its preliminary efficacy results, all of them above 90%. There did seem to be a moment of comical geopolitical competition that Russia couldn't quite help itself from taking part in, and that Gamaleya Institute was announcing its results clearly in response to the published results, quite promising and positive from Pfizer and Moderna. There was a somewhat comical back and forth where Pfizer would announce its results on Monday, Gamaleya would announce its results on Wednesday, Moderna would announce its results the next week. 2 days later, Gamaleya would announce that it even had better results. Finally, the ultimate results that Gamaleya Institute settled on, the ultimate efficacy number that Gamaleya Institute settled on, is 91.6%. That was a figure that indeed made it into the Lancet in February. We can talk about whether or not that kind of confirms the 91.6 percentage figure or not. Again, I'm sure Enrico will tell us more about that in a moment. But nonetheless, that was certainly seen here in Russia, and I think internationally, as a kind of confirmation of what Russia had been saying all along. If Putin's boasting, not just in August, but throughout the fall, combined with the clear geopolitically tinged propaganda onslaught from Russian media, led to some instinctual and well-founded suspicion, then the announcement of the efficacy figures and the publication of Lancet seemed to suggest that there was actually a solid scientific underpinning to the vaccine. And I would say it looks to me now like there has been an unfortunate kind of contest, unfortunate for Russians and perhaps for other countries that could be making use of Sputnik V, that the politics and the hype have gotten in the way of a more restrained and credible conversation around the science, which in the end would have done Russia much better than trying to be first to the gate and getting whatever kind of geopolitical credit or medal goes to being first, which is clearly what the Kremlin was after with that announcement in August. Judy spoke a lot about why, or rather how, that the uptake in Russia has actually been rather slow. As of today, only around 3.5% of Russians have been vaccinated, compared to 17% in the US, 32% in the UK. Those numbers maybe a bit out of date, but nonetheless, it shows that despite being first, technically or kind of officially with a registered vaccine, Russia is now really being outpaced and outlapped by other countries who got there later. I think the main reason for that, although there are many, I'll highlight one, which is essentially, again, the state propaganda campaign worked against itself. I spoke for my article in the New Yorker to Denise Volkov, who's the deputy director of the Levada Center, an institution I'm sure many of you know, who has done, Volkov himself as well, the Levada Center as an institution, have done a lot of polling around coronavirus, around Sputnik V in Russia, trying to get a sense of why so few people, according to the Levada Center, as low as only 30% of Russians are willing to get vaccinated. That's among the lowest figure anywhere in the world. There are a few places where under a third of the general population expresses an interest in being vaccinated. Russia is unfortunately near the bottom of that list. And so I asked Volkov, why that might be. A lot has to do with a kind of ingrained skepticism toward the state, going back to the Soviet period, very well-founded and understandable habits of mind and habits of relating to state programs, to what you see on state television, to what leaders, whether Putin or others, decide to beat their chests about and speak about with great pride and victory. So that tends to produce the opposite result in a lot of Russian citizens. I think the main reason, or the one I want to highlight, is that the state has continuously played down the danger of coronavirus, especially in recent months and certainly in recent weeks. The message on state television and from state officials, starting from Putin going all the way to Moscow's mayor, is that the pandemic is essentially over and that Russia managed it successfully. The pandemic has come to a close. Russia is opening up. Moscow, for months now, has been a shockingly open city. You can go to the Bolshoi Theater. You can go to a nightclub. I mean, you can do just about anything you want, and there are a few restrictions compared to pre-pandemic life. You're supposed to wear masks in public and so on, but nonetheless, you can have a dinner in a packed restaurant. And the state has really pushed this message of normalcy. And as Volkov told me, that has led to the impression among many Russians that there simply isn't a need for the coronavirus vaccine, that people would not be convinced by a message of how great and wonderful and superior the vaccine is. They needed to be convinced by a message that in the end wasn't delivered, of how dangerous coronavirus is. And since that message was missing, people don't feel the same urgency or need to get vaccinated as in other countries. It's a kind of eminently passable or skippable vaccination. I'll close just by talking about my own experience. I was not under the impression that the pandemic was over. I watched and heard and followed with great alarm as many of my friends and acquaintances were infected with coronavirus in Moscow, especially in the fall and winter second wave. It felt like every day I was hearing about someone came down with the virus. A friend of mine spent a week in a makeshift hospital on the territory of Vydyanka, the Soviet-era exhibition ground. So I felt like the virus was very much an ever-present danger, and weighing ultimately the concerns and questions surrounding Sputnik V, but also this feeling that the virus was everywhere, and it was only a matter of time if I remained unvaccinated that I too could become infected. That was at least the fear that felt very realistic to me. In late December, I decided to get Sputnik V myself. It was very accessible, very easy. I showed up at a clinic with no appointment, state clinic in the center of Moscow, nothing but my passport, and expressed my desire to be vaccinated. And within about 10 minutes, I had a needle in my arm. 3 weeks later, I got my second shot. That would be late or mid-January. For the purposes of my own knowledge and in the service of journalism, I took an antibody test about 3 weeks after that. I seem to have antibody levels that, according to the test, are protective. I've not caught coronavirus. That's of course no. Enrico and others will wisely note that really means nothing for the purposes of demonstrating Sputnik V's efficacy or not. But nonetheless, I suppose I'm now somewhat invested or even kind of biased observer of Sputnik V, and that I'm counting on it to protect me. But so far, knock on wood, it seems to.
Oh, great. Josh, thanks so much. And also for noting your own personal experience with this, as well as the skepticism in Russian society about that vaccine. Next speaker today, I would like to welcome Dr. Enrico Bucci, who is Director of System Biology Program of the Sparrow Health Research Organization at Temple University. He's also an adjunct professor of biology, and he has been a quite prolific commentator on some of the design of the research study that was published in The Lancet, actually the two different publications, and he was part of a team that wrote a response to the first study, and also has posted quite extensively some concerns with the second paper on his blog, and we'll include that in the chat here. So Enrico has kindly agreed to share with us some of those concerns for sort of a wider audience. Thanks so much for joining us today.
So thank you and welcome everybody. So first of all, let me start from one very important point. I think that the science behind the Sputnik vaccine is a sound science. The problem is that you do not only need a science to be sound, you need also to prove it. And to prove in science means to show actual data in full details from which you can repeat all calculations that led the authors of a paper to draw their conclusions. This is not the case for both papers into The Lancet. So the very first important point is that Russian researchers refused for both papers to share their data with scientific community. I'm not claiming that one has to share all single details about any single patient that is involved in the study. What I'm claiming is that we need to have access to such an amount of data to be able to reproduce exactly the same calculations that were performed in the two papers by the Russian authors. This is not the case. Indeed, Loganov, after the request, I mean, we and others made multiple requests for having access to the data, and we never got any answer by the researchers, but there were public declaration by Loganov, which was, for example, saying that if anyone in the world, 7 billion of people are asking for access to the data, then there would be no place to run a proper research. Of course, we are not simple individuals in the world. We are colleagues that are asking for having access to the data because we saw some strange patterns in the data in both the papers. In the first, so the phase 2 paper, where there were repeated patterns of data which are statistically highly unlikely, and there are several other small, let's say, mishaps or errors, and we see also several different problems also in the phase 3 paper. So we are kindly in a position where we see that there is something strange, let's see, and we have no way to check what's the source for those patterns we are seeing into the data, because we are denied access to the data. And actually, in the second paper, so the phase 3 paper in February, they even added in the data sharing wording that they would share the data after approval by several different stakeholders. And among those stakeholders, there is a so-called security department. This is unheard for science. There is no way you can have such things like a security department approving access to the data for researchers. I mean, it's something really unheard of, and something which is really also worrying us on two levels. First, that the authors themselves inserted this further clause and barrier to data access, and also that the Lancet accepted it. This is why we are currently waiting for the approval of another letter we were asked to write by the Lancet, which will address several concerns we have with the phase 3 paper. So that says, one said that the major problem here is exactly what Joshua was pointing at. They were cut in corner without giving even the possibility to other researchers to check for the claims that are in the papers. That said, we still trust this vaccine. And the reason is very simple. I mean, this vaccine is there is a very clever change in a very well-established technology. Instead of using only one single vaccine, like Joshua said, they used two different vectors for their spike proteins. In the first dose, they used adenovirus 26. In the second dose, they use adenovirus 5. This is very clever because the problem is that once you inject a virus, so adenovirus 26, the body will build up immunity not only against the spike protein, but also against the vector. So if you give the second dose with this very same vector, like for example in the AstraZeneca vaccine, you will end up, or you risk to end up, with no effect at all because your immune system will neutralize also the vector, not only the spike protein. So they change in the second dose the vector, so they carry the same protein with the second vector, which is adenovirus 5, to avoid this problem, which is a very clever move and conception indeed. But you have to prove in full detail what's the efficacy of the approach is and what the safety of the approach is. And actually, we are currently starting to have some real-world data coming from Argentina. You may know that Argentina is one of the countries which started vaccinating with the Sputnik vaccine, in a very large scale. And 2 days ago, there were 7 hospitals releasing the first data detailing the antibody level which was formed into the patients, into the vaccinated people after receiving 1 and then 2 doses of the vaccine. And what they declared and what they show in their data is that if you were previously infected by the coronavirus, then you get exactly the level of antibodies that is published into the Lancet by the Russian researchers. Instead, if you were never infected before by the coronavirus, your level of antibodies forms is 8 times below what has been declared and published into the Lancet. And another thing which is also interesting is about the side effects that they are recording in Argentina. You can go in their data sets and check, and you will see that indeed there are the percentage of serious adverse effects is not such a big deal, and it's not very important like they published, but the number of people experiencing mild adverse effects is far higher than has been published. So what happens right now by looking at these data that are just starting to arrive is exactly that they were exaggerating both the efficacy and safety. So it's not that vaccine is not working, it's not that the vaccine is not a clever one, it's not that the science is not sound, it's the fact that they were hurrying and they were publishing things before they were really proved and were not allowing people to check for the numbers that they were declaring. So to me, it looked like they were deciding how much the vaccine has to be declared to be effective and safe, and they just put this number out just because Pfizer said that their vaccine had 90% efficacy, they have to declare that their own vaccine and to publish that their own vaccine had 91% efficacy and so on. The true efficacy is the efficacy you would expect for an adenoviral vaccine, is fully consistent with Johnson & Johnson efficacy and fully consistent also with the AstraZeneca vaccine. And there is one thing more. As I said, the first dose of the Gamaleya vaccine is adenovirus 26 with the spike protein. This is exactly the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So the first dose of the Gamaleya vaccine is exactly equivalent to the single dose of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. So the problem now arises when you have to produce it. When you have to produce the Russian vaccine, you really have to produce 2 vaccines. One based on the adenovirus 26 for the first dose, and one based on the adenovirus 5 for the second dose. And the interesting thing is that now they are starting to market what they call Sputnik Light. And you know what is this Sputnik Light is the first dose of the Sputnik we already know. So that means it's something which is completely equivalent to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is marketed as Sputnik Light vaccine. And they do this with very good reasons, because they have all the data on security and also efficacy on the variants, the South African variants of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is pretty much the same things. And they are developing, and they are already in phase 3. Starting in January, they arrived already in phase 3, experiencing the so-called Sputnik Light. So basically the first dose of the Sputnik vaccine. All those things have nothing to do with science. They have a lot to do with marketing and soft power. I mean, they are really trying to push hard the idea and the concept that their vaccine is best, that is ready and is cheap. While we are really interested right now as scientists in to understand what the real numbers in terms of efficacy and in terms of safety are, and we have no access to that. Still today, the clinical protocol for the trials was never ever released in full details. Not only that, we didn't even know exactly what is into the vaccine, because the spike protein sequence, which is into the vector, has never been published. So we, for example, don't know whether this is the stabilized version of the spike protein, like for the Johnson & Johnson and the AstraZeneca vaccine, or not. We still miss a lot of details. We only have this continuous campaign, which contaminated also Russian science, because scientists themselves are participating into this. And they release even contradictory statements. If you look to the 3 press release they released from September to December, they are contradictory with respect to what they have published into the Lancet. This is another thing which tells you that they were claiming efficacy before having analyzed in full details all the data. And actually right now there are 3 corrections published for the 2 papers on the Lancet. And maybe in the future there will be further corrections arrive. So we have 2 problems. From one side, politics, which is overruling science in Russia. This is one. And from the other side, we have an important journal, which is the Lancet, which is accepting all of that. So it is accepting to have papers published without the authors providing access to the data needed, not to the full record of the clinical trials, but to the data needed to reproduce their findings, which is only a tiny amount of the overall data necessary for producing a clinical trial. And at this point, we think that we will learn the true efficacy and the true safety of this vaccine, which in any case, as I will repeat, is expected to have efficacy and safety. We will learn all of them at the expense of states like Argentina and people in poor country that are delivering this particular job. We will never have access to the true data from Russia. And this is a problem, and this will be a huge problem for the credibility of the Russian science, which was very unfortunate, also concerning the fact that the criticism, the very first criticism which were striking this vaccine at the Gamaleya Institute came from the son of the founder of the Gamaleya Institute, which is Dr. Chulmakov, which was already involved also in uncovering a scandal with vaccine contamination in the past. I finished. That's it.
So much. Thank you. And then our final panelist for today is Alexandra Yatsik, who is a fellow with the Free Russia Foundation. She also has taught and been a researcher at the University of Tartu, Estonia. She is a member of the group Ponar's Eurasia, a group of scholars who offer commentaries, and has written a very interesting paper on the Kremlin's vaccine diplomacy. And we will post that in the chat here. So Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll turn it over to you for the geopolitical international dimensions.
Thank you, Alex. In order to have a holistic approach to understand the Russian government's vaccine diplomacy, it is important to look at 3 stages of Sputnik V diplomacy. So, and it is important to mention the initial phase of the outbreak in April-May 2020, when Russian government tried to produce the related aid, COVID-19 related aid to 46 countries around the world. And chaotic responses nearby the EU and beyond to the extraordinary epidemiological emergency created a window of opportunity for Russia to endeavor this situation. And in Europe, Russia produced aid to Italy, Serbia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I think that the case of Italy could be interesting in terms of revealing this weak link in EU COVID-19 policy. As you know, in March, several plane loads of medical equipment were sent to Italy, so-called From Russia with Love. At that moment, badly virus bettered Italy, and these actions were loudly trumpeted in the Russian state-controlled media as an expression of Russia generosity. But later, this plan backfired when the Italian media reported that Russia's 104-man strong team of medics included representatives of Russian military intelligence service, GRU, and that at least 80% of these supplies were useless. And even more embarrassing was the report by Italian La Repubblica in April. Then the Italians were offered €200 for recording videos thanking the Russian authorities for their assistance. So at that stage, I would say that Kremlin was not successful in its attempts to promote the Russian version of COVID-19 aid. So, for instance, in Serbia, it was also not successful because it was done before by China when it sent aircraft to Belgrade. So the second phase, the second stage was in August-November 2020. And this stage is characterized by the deliberately expedited regulatory approval of Sputnik V in order to later claim that this is the first registered vaccine in the world. And definitely that this Russian government's fast-track approach to vaccine development reflects its desire to be in the forefront of the global fight against COVID-19, and definitely that Kremlin wanted to show that Russia had a great power again. And as soon as the Sputnik was domestically registered, and even before, as you know, as you mentioned, before the international recognition by the scientific community, the Russian Direct Investment Fund began aggressively promote the Sputnik V. So that was reflected by preliminary agreement to supply 1.
Oh, we have lost the audio here. Okay, so let's see if we can get Alexandra. Oh, are you back?
Oh,
we lost you there just for a second.
Can you see my presentation?
No.
Okay. So and I'm just thinking. Is that? Can you see? Can you see my presentation?
No, I think you're going to have to share your screen again, but we can hear you fine now.
Okay. Is that all right?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, good.
You're back
good.
on. Yep, perfect.
I'm just saying that in March, as of March 7, 46 countries with the total population of 1.2 billion people approved the use of Sputnik V on their territories. As Judith mentioned, only 18 have this for using. In its interview to Italian TV channel on March 7, the head of fund, Kirill Dmitriev, said that this fund intends to cooperate with Swiss company Adyen Pharma and Biotech for joint production of Sputnik V in Italy. And by the end of March, he said that the fund will announce about 20 potential projects with 10 countries, including Italy. And at the moment, it is a stage of negotiation with France and Germany, and also Austria is interested in cooperation with Russia. And at that stage, I would say that Russia were late in submitting to the vaccine documentation to the European Medicine Agency. And this rushed regulatory approval served a specific tactical purpose, which is now evident when we look at the containers that we were sent to different countries. And if we look at that containers, we definitely see the big label, the first registered vaccine. So even it was first registered in Russia. And of course, it was a risky move to be sure, because the efficacy of the vaccine that time wasn't internationally recognized. But after the Sputnik V was recognized by Lancet magazine, it was definitely watershed moment, because it gave the Sputnik the international international legitimacy. And of course, that worked at promotion for Sputnik V and provide the major PR benefit for Russian government. And it's important that all of this is taking place against the backdrop of rather chaotic and very uneven vaccine rollout around the globe, but especially in Europe. For instance, according to Bloomberg, EU fails its vaccination plan as of the first quarter of 2021, which threatens by loss at 100 billion euros. So interesting question, how successful has been Russia's vaccine diplomacy on its need abroad? If we look at, for example, Ukraine and Georgia, we see that due to toxic bilateral relations, very low likelihood that either of these governments will procure Sputnik V. Belarus will launch the production of Sputnik V by the end of March. Azerbaijan has Chinese vaccine. And this is, again, very interesting question because Russian Sputnik V vaccine is now competing with the Chinese Sinovac. And this is particularly evident in Central Asia context. There's also very interesting question that China provides for free to 76 countries its vaccine around the world. And I didn't find any information whether the Russian fund provides for free vaccine to the countries. So at that point, I would contradict to Judy, because she said that Russia demonstrating generosity, but I would say that no, because China, that sense, demonstrates the generosity because it provides its vaccine for free. But this is not the case for Russia. And the third stage, which is also very important in terms of understanding the Russia vaccine diplomacy, is Russia's disinformation campaign because just after the first Western vaccine was introduced, Russia started its disinformation campaign, and the disinformation campaign from Russia targeting the Pfizer was quite aggressive. So, for instance, according to Wall Street Journal, Russian intelligence agencies have mounted a campaign to undermine confidence in Pfizer. For example, there were four sources that tries to compromise Pfizer and other Western vaccines. And interesting that, for example, all kind of Russian intelligence agencies were involved. For instance, the Russia Foreign Intelligence Service, the FSB, and also GRU, which is Russia Arm Department service. And also, if we look at, for example, survey done by Stratcom, they also said that there is a lot of disinformation produced by Russian-speaking media, and a lot of anti-Pfizer narrative and also anti-Moderna narrative. And if we look at the strategy that used by Russian language media, it could be characterized as a half-truth, or, for example, to produce a big lie about Western vaccines. And to conclude, yes, and it's very important that the reach of the audience using these anti-vaccine narratives is quite limited, because it relies on conspiracy theories and also groups that sharing these narratives and attitudes. And what makes the situation worse is that there is a high degree of public skepticism towards the vaccine. For example, according to global survey of public attitudes towards COVID-19, which was conducted by Ipsos in mid-December, only 43% of respondents in Russia expressed their willingness to get vaccinated. And again, as Judith, I suppose, mentioned, as Josh mentioned, Russian trusted the vaccination, but this is not true, because, for example, even French people were most skeptical towards this vaccination. So if you look at the data of this survey, you see that Russians supported the vaccination. 43% of Russians supported the vaccination. Only 40% of French supported the vaccination. So there is a lot of skepticism around the idea of vaccination, and it is because of this skepticism towards the COVID or COVID-19. So, and to conclude this summary, this observation about the Russian vaccine policy, I would say that with an impending approval of Sputnik V by MAA, definitely will acquire the much needed legitimacy in the EU. And definitely it will make Russian government's promotion efforts easier. And the Russian government undoubtedly hope that this vector will allow to normalize its relation with EU. And in words of CEO of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, Kirill Dmitriev, in its interview to France 24 channel on March 7, we want to vaccine not to be political, and that expanding its use would be one of the non-political bridges to Russia and Europe can have together. And so I would say that Russia tries to switch the geopolitical idea of be the first nation and be the great nation that was used at the first stage to the idea of normalizing strategy and to be a partner with the West in producing vaccine. So this is a kind of more governance-oriented strategy at that stage. Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much for all of our panelists for these incredibly informative presentations. I know Alex and I had said at the beginning we had asked people to go 10 minutes, but Alex and I made a decision on the fly that because there was sort of so much basic information here for us to be communicated about the science as well, we were going to let people go longer. And so I, for one, have learned an incredible amount in the last hour. And so I'm just incredibly appreciative of the panelists. I want to begin by I want to offer one observation and then I'm going to jump into questions. And because we've gone so much longer, I'm going to try to handle the questions a slightly different way than we normally do. But I'm going to try to bundle a bunch of things here. But the note that I want to mention is that I found it very interesting as someone who studies mass political behavior, listening to, I think Judy and Josh both made comments along these lines about the skepticism of the Russian population for its own regime's propaganda. And why I found this interesting is because there seems to be a tension here between hearing as part of this discussion about COVID and about Sputnik V in particular, right, this distrust of the regime versus what we also often get in lots of other discussions, which is, look how slick Russia's propaganda is. And even though there's all this stuff on the internet, everyone just really watches TV and the regime can convince anybody of anything they want to do using the TV, using television, right? And we get this all the time when we're talking about propaganda, disinformation, public opinion. And then among people in particular who've been interested in what we know about Putin's approval ratings, what Putin's approval ratings mean. We've been having discussions about this for 10 years, which is, well, how thick or how deep is Putin's public approval, right? Like people will say, yes, I approve of Putin, but what does it really matter? And I wonder if we'll look back on this as a sign that some of this, of the approval for Putin, the approval for Putin's regime was actually less deep than we thought, right? And I wonder if that's also going to be undercut by the disconnect. And here I also feel very much that I'm talking about my own country, but the disconnect between what Josh was saying about the regime saying it's over, and yet all of his friends are getting COVID, right? And we have, this is a thing that's, I think is an issue in the United States. And as we once again are watching people say that COVID's over, the pandemic is over in particular parts of the States. But I wonder if that will also be something we sort of look back on as undermining credibility that's going in. All right, so that's just an observation on my part. What I want to do is I want to grab right now, there's a bunch of questions and I want to flag for all of our participants. There's a bunch of questions that I would call sort of information questions in the in the Q&A, and these are information questions about like very just for kind of specific things, right? So we have one question about whether the vaccine is free in Russia. Is it, when people are getting it in Russia, do they have to pay for it at all? And then what about people getting Sputnik V in other countries? Are these deals that are being made at the level of whether or not people have to pay in other countries? That was from Katrina. Peter Rutland asks, what's the capacity for scaling up in Russia production? Elise Giuliano was responding generally to Josh, but I think we'll sort of extrapolate from her question about, like, Josh, is your experience unique, or do most Westerners who you know in Moscow, are they now getting the vaccine? And then we had another question from Vera Smirnova asking, was Sputnik V really the first one, or was China using it earlier? Now, rather than passing along to everyone to answer those questions, I'm just throwing those out there. If you have answers for any of those questions, when you go to answer these other questions, feel free to jump in and get any of these sort of factual details that we have here. Now, what I want to do is I want to sort of, I have a series of kind of more, I would call them not detail questions, but more interpretation questions and more sort of deeper dive questions. And I'd love to get through as many of them as we can. And so what I'm going to do is throw a few of these out there and then go around to the panelists, and the panelists can sort of answer which ones they would like. So Katrina Vandenheuvel asks, how important was the Lancet story in the success of distribution? So that's one question I want to put on the table. Ken Pinow raises the question of what's going on with Russia's relationship with China here, And in particular, China, also a kind of an early vaccine developer, but China makes the decision to participate in COVAX. Why is Russia not making the decision to participate in COVAX? How much is Russia? This has been cast as a kind of Russia versus the West, but could people make some comments here about Russia versus China as part of this story? And then Tanatin, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing the name wrong here, asks about, in particular, points to the problems with getting the vaccine in the near abroad, noticing that while Abkhazia and South Ossetia are relying on Russian vaccine supplies, Georgia has rejected Sputnik V, even though there isn't any vaccine that's being distributed in Georgia. So is there something in particular Russia can do to address this lack of credibility or lack of support, even in its own near abroad? And finally, Jakob asks whether, and in particular asked at Alexandra, do you think Russia has unlearned how to use soft power? And if so, why? So another question in that regard. So I'm going to throw those out there. We have about 20 minutes left. Given everything everybody has to say, I thought we could go around to each of the speakers once, maybe in the order that they've gone. And Judy, you're going to go first, so maybe you'll knock out as many of those detailed questions I asked in the beginning. But then you can choose which are one. Take 5 minutes to respond to whichever of these in whichever way you'd like to respond right now. Otherwise, I think we're just going to lose too many of the questions. So Judy, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Josh. So hitting a few of these. First, your comment about the extent to which the vaccine hesitancy in Russia speaks to increasing sort of distrust of Putin or the shallowness of the sort of hold that Putin has on communications and ability to convince people to do things. I think that we can actually go at least a little further back in the COVID pandemic and see the roots of this emerging in obviously inaccurate data that was coming out even before we heard anything about Sputnik V. So you remember the controversies back from April, May, June about the Russian regime not reporting accurate sickness rates and especially death rates from COVID. And I think a lot of people, both globally and in Russia, were asking questions about the mismatch between the numbers that were being reported and what people could see around them with their own eyes. And so I think that distrust has roots across the pandemic and not just with the vaccine. In terms of whether that Lancet article was instrumental in getting countries to sign up for Sputnik, absolutely. I think there were quite a few that were on the fence that had questions about the data, were waiting for some kind of reliable marker that this was an opportunity worth taking advantage of. And I think quite a few took the plunge once the second Lancet article came out, the one in early February that presented the results from the phase 3 clinical trials. In terms of the price globally for not just Sputnik V, but for all of the vaccines that are coming available on global markets, there's not a whole lot of transparency around the pricing and the terms of these deals, so that we have the Russia Direct Investment Fund telling us that it's $10 a dose, $20 for the full 2-course treatment, but we have not seen anything in terms of the fine print of what's in these contracts, what the actual deals are that are being made with individual countries. So I think we put a pin in that question because we don't have good data on what's going on here. And I'm just last one I'll address is to be grateful for the question about China, because I think in terms of the overall landscape of vaccine diplomacy, it's hard to have a conversation about Russia in isolation. I think we also have to look at COVAX, at China, and I think increasingly India we should be paying more attention to, since India is such a prominent and prolific manufacturer of generic medicines and of vaccines, the role that India is going to play and the soft power that India is going to be able to extract from the pandemic. Speaking particularly of China, of course, China has been practicing pretty aggressive vaccine diplomacy. China was not the first in the world to have its regulator approve a vaccine. Russia was the first to do that. But yeah, China was using its own vaccines way before that. It didn't even bother to officially register or approve the vaccine before it just started using it in a big way. China did sign up for COVAX very early on. I think that was an attempt to contrast to the Trump administration's not doing so. Its pledge to COVAX has been fairly minimal, about 10 million doses of Chinese vaccine. And so China is still practicing vaccine diplomacy primarily through these bilateral deals to places where it has interests, sub-Saharan Africa, its own neighborhood in Asia. And in terms of what China and India can do relative to Pfizer, Moderna, some of the Western vaccines like AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson, I think we need to fast forward ahead by a few months and get out of the current situation where globally demand so far exceeds supply that everybody's happy to take whatever they can get, and move forward to a point that maybe we're not going to get there soon, but eventually we're going to get to a point where countries can start sort of vaccine shopping a little bit. They can be a little bit pickier about what vaccine they're going to take, much like we're starting to see emerge in the United States. Right now, the Johnson & Johnson is coming out, and the reported efficacy numbers for J&J are a little bit lower, and you see some people and some levels of government starting to say, we'd rather have Pfizer or Moderna because their numbers are in the 90s, and we'd rather not have a vaccine like J&J with numbers in the 70s or AstraZeneca that'll come along soon with numbers more in the 60s or 70s. When that starts to happen, it will be very interesting to see how successful some of this vaccine diplomacy turns out to be when there's more shopping involved.
Thanks, Judy. Thanks so much. Josh, as we move over to you, there was one, I'm going to throw one more question on the heifer, which came out of the YouTube channel, which was that, do we know if Putin has been vaccinated at all? If so, what vaccine did Putin use? And if he did, why did he not use this as a kind of opportunity to go on TV and promote Sputnik V, unless he did, and the questioner and myself are not aware of it? All right, Josh, passing over to you. Just throwing one more thing on the plate there.
I also want to return very quickly to your point about kind of propaganda and perhaps the limited efficacy of propaganda and what that says about support for the Putin system. I think that's a key point for understanding the longevity of the Putin system. It's not based on kind of deep, genuine support, enthusiasm, belief in the virtue and kind of strength and credibility of the state. It's largely based in a sense of lack of alternatives, a favoring of stability over the unknown, kind of large strategic or structural reasons that cause people to favor the Putin system, warts and all, rather than what may come if it were to be replaced. But people are very clear-eyed about the warts. In other words, there's not, propaganda has not kind of managed to dissuade or convince the Russian people en masse that there aren't serious problems and weaknesses with the Putin system. My favorite example of this comes from 2016 in the wake of the release of the Panama Papers revelations, which showed allegations of quite credible allegations of corruption in Putin's inner circle, billions of dollars flowing to offshore accounts, coming back to Russia in shady ways, presaging actually the Navalny's Putin's Palace investigation from January. The Levada Center, which I mentioned in my talk, did a poll that showed well over half of those polled thought that the allegations in the Panama Papers were either entirely kind of credible, legit, seemed to be true, or at least well within the realm of possibilities. We had over half of Russians surveyed saying that they thought corruption at the very top and heart of Putin's system was likely or probable. That very same month, Levada did its regular polling to gauge Putin's support, at which he got a number, I forget the exact figure, but well above 80%. And I think that the fact that those two figures came in the same month show you a lot about the kind of cognitive dissonance that lies at the heart of the Putin system's longevity, which is not due to a kind of wool over their eyes understanding among the Russian public about the nature of that system and its capabilities, which led to the skepticism we've seen for the vaccine. People can both want the Putin system to stay because they fear chaos and still not at all trust a vaccine that has come out of that system. As to some of the particulars about how the vaccine works here in Moscow, it is interesting to note that despite that very low figure of whether it's 40%, 30% of vaccine acceptance or readiness among the Russian population at large, it's about, anecdotally in my experience, about 100% among Western journalists or just Westerners living in Moscow. Foreigners in Moscow, again, perhaps by following their own local media that have reported on the coronavirus pandemic back home, or kind of a diet of independent media here in Russia. Whatever the case may be, people were rightfully and understandably freaked out about the pandemic and eager to have any measure of protection they could, especially as the second wave in Moscow was quite extensive and long, and the city itself seemed to be taking very few, if any, precautionary measures. That led just about every foreigner I know in Moscow to have been vaccinated, which does come at a very interesting contrast to the low level of support among Russians, which is also anecdotally backed up by my own experience in that, many Russian friends are not vaccinated and remain skeptical, even as my foreign friends have just about all of them gone in for the shot. It's free, absolutely free. I didn't pay a cent. Certainly a Russian citizen doesn't pay a cent, but I got both my shots absolutely for free at a state clinic. And it's my understanding that anywhere in Russia, the shot is delivered absolutely free of charge. Judy spoke to some of the questions and gray area surrounding cost internationally. So I think it's hard to speak definitively about what the vaccine may cost in foreign markets, though I understand largely we're talking about governments buying Sputnik V to then deliver for free to its citizens, but that's not really a question for Russia. That's a question for Argentina, Hungary, and so on. As for Putin, glad that question came up. One of the other kind of real PR weaknesses, and one of the more bizarre PR weaknesses of the rollout inside Russia, is that Putin has not been vaccinated. It's now March. The vaccine was approved by Putin, as we've talked about, in this really celebratory, triumphant way in August. Here it is in March. Putin hasn't been vaccinated. His spokesperson is very evasive, strangely so, on the question, saying maybe Putin will do it at a later date. I don't know what is going on kind of behind the scenes. Is there some sort of strange health issue we don't know about? Is Putin happy to continue to live in isolation where people have to go through 2-week quarantine before they meet him in the Kremlin? I don't know. We don't know what's going on, but certainly it doesn't help the vaccine's image inside Russia that the president who launched the vaccine in this really celebratory public way still hasn't been vaccinated by it.
Thanks, Josh. All right, next over to Enrico.
Yeah, thank you. So concerning the real production output from Russia, we know that in 2020, the Russian Direct Investment Fund said that they had signed a contract for 2,400 million doses. But reality is quite different. So there is a company in England, in London, which is called Airfinity. They checked the contract that the Russian had already signed, and it turns out that till now they had roughly signed contract for roughly 400 million doses, and there are maybe 350 something million more that are in talks with other nation. So this is by far less than what has been communicated. But the point is that up to December 2020, only 2 million doses were produced by Russia. And recently, the Prime Minister, which is Mishustin, he declared on February 20 that Russia has produced over 10 million doses. So this is way far from the doses that they have already promised both to Russians and to other countries. And this was recognized by Putin also already by saying that they had problems with the 9 companies which are in Russia involved to the production. This is why there's someone in Argentina for local production, and they are roughly, they have roughly 3 or maybe 4 contracts all over the world with other companies, and they are discussing for local production all over the world, both also in Italy. For example, they were recently coming in Rome and discussing for installing a local production even before approval from the EMA, so from the regulatory authorities. So the thing is that right now, the potential output of the full production pipeline is very low, even compared to the contract they already signed.
Okay, sorry, you cut out there.
Hello?
Enrico. Yeah, no, I don't want to interrupt you. Are you finished?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. All right. Thank you so much. Alexandra?
I would support Enrico's comment, because the main problem of Russia competition with China, for instance, it's limited capacity, production capacity. So Russia pretends to compete with China on the second rank agents of vaccination diplomacy, but it is not possible, because it is not possible to achieve these goals and to satisfy all promises that Russia done in terms of producing all these billions doses. So I mean, at least at that moment, it is not possible, and Russia struggling with limitation of production capacity. So is it possible to use soft power, and what lessons Russia learned of using soft power? So I would say that the problem with the Russia's soft power is that there is no coherent soft power at all as produced by Russia, because, for example, after Navalny's poisoning, Russia still is quite successful at the geopolitical age in terms of vaccine diplomacy, for instance. So there is no consequences after Navalny's poisoning. So at the same time, is that soft power? I'm not sure that. I think that it just kind of definitely not soft power as it seemed by Western approach. So this is kind of even not sharp power, but I don't know, hybrid power as produced by Putin's regime. And I also support Judy's point that publication in Lancet magazine was a kind of watershed point for justification of Russian vaccine. And it's very important for Russians to have this publication. And answering on the question about what Russia can do to lack the credibility in terms of producing vaccine to Georgia, I think that this is the political thing. So, it is very important not to use Russians vaccine in Georgia because of all these historical and political tensions. So I'm not sure that Georgia will be agreed to accept Russia's vaccine.
Great, thank you. So, dear colleagues and audience members, we are pretty much out of time. We have covered a tremendous sweep of both internal politics, academic politics, explained research procedures, as well as international politics. I want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us, Judy and Josh and Enrico and Alexandra. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you to the audience members. Sorry we couldn't answer all of your questions, but this is a really important topic, and something tells me we will return to this in the future. So I hope you will join us for that, as well as all of our other sessions here. On behalf of Josh, thanks again for joining us. Thank you to Carnegie for supporting us. Stay safe, everyone, and we shall see you very soon, we hope.